On the 13th of October, in the year 1307, King Philip IV of France signed an order that would change history forever. At dawn, across every corner of his kingdom, thousands of knights were arrested simultaneously. The Knights Templar, the most powerful military order in Christendom, the bankers of kings and popes, were destroyed in a single coordinated strike. But the official charges of heresy and blasphemy were lies designed to hide something far more dangerous than any crime they could fabricate. 60 Templar ships vanished from La Rochelle harbor the night before the arrests. 18 galleys, loaded with the order's most precious cargo, sailed into darkness and were never seen again by European authorities. The Church claimed they carried gold, treasure looted from the Crusades. But documents that survived the purge tell a different story. Those ships carried something the Vatican feared more than any army, more than any amount of gold. They carried knowledge that could unravel 14 centuries of carefully constructed religious authority. 200 years earlier, in the scorching deserts of the Middle East, 9 French knights had arrived in Jerusalem with a mission that made no strategic sense. They offered to protect Christian pilgrims, yet for 9 years they protected no one. Instead, they excavated beneath the Temple Mount, digging through layers of history, searching for something specific. When they finally emerged, they returned to Europe transformed. Within 2 decades, a group of 9 landless knights had become the richest, most powerful organization in the known world. What had they found buried beneath that sacred ground? The answer wasn't in Jerusalem. It was in Egypt. Medieval chronicles, systematically censored by the Church, described Templar expeditions to Luxor, to the Great Pyramids of Giza, to temples along the Nile that predated Christianity by thousands of years. Arab historians recorded their presence, their obsessive interest in hieroglyphs no European could read, their determination to access sealed chambers beneath monuments that were already ancient when Rome was born. They were searching for something the pharaohs had hidden, and when they found it, they understood why it had been buried. The evidence exists, not in textbooks or museums, but in fragments scattered across centuries of suppressed documentation. In Vatican archives 50 kilometers deep that no outsider has ever fully accessed. In Templar chapels across Europe where Egyptian symbolism appears in places no medieval Christian should have known. In depositions from the torture chambers, where knights chose burning at the stake over revealing what they had discovered. The truth was so explosive that an entire order of warrior monks had to be annihilated to keep it hidden. And 8 centuries later, that same truth remains buried, guarded by institutions that have everything to lose if it ever comes to light. Imagine that right now, at this very moment, there exists documentation that completely rewrites everything you know about the Knights Templar. But it is not in the history books you studied in school. It is not in the museums you visit on vacation. It is not displayed in any university library in the world. This documentation is hidden, deliberately erased from the official historical record. And here is the worst part. The same institutions that hid this truth centuries ago still have the power to ensure you never discover it. They have kept this secret for more than 700 years, and they intend to keep it for 700 more. Let me give you some numbers that will shatter your perception of what you think you know. When the Knights Templar were destroyed in 1307, the Catholic Church confiscated everything they owned. Every castle, every commandery, every chapel, every document. The official inventory lists were extensive, detailing gold, silver, land deeds, weapons, horses. But there is one category that appears suspiciously minimal in those records: manuscripts and written documents. The Church claimed the Templars possessed only a few dozen administrative papers. This is impossible. The Templars were the most sophisticated organization of the medieval period, operating across 12 countries, managing a banking network that financed kingdoms, coordinating military operations across 3 continents. They kept meticulous records of everything. So where did those records go? Historians estimate that the Templars produced at least 50,000 pages of documentation during their 200-year existence. Tax records, correspondence with popes and kings, reports from their missions in the Holy Land, architectural plans, financial ledgers, and most importantly, their internal chronicles that detailed what they actually discovered during their excavations beneath the Temple Mount. 50,000 pages minimum. The Church accounted for less than 300. That means more than 49,700 pages of Templar documentation vanished, not lost to time, not destroyed by accident, deliberately eliminated, systematically burned. And you have to ask yourself, what was written on those pages that required such complete destruction? For every manuscript you can find in a library about the Knights Templar today, there are 166 manuscripts that were burned. For every fact you were taught in school about their history, there are 166 facts that were censored. You live in a reality where you only see half of 1% of the truth. The rest was buried. Literally. Some of it in fire. Some of it in archives so restricted that even professional historians with the highest clearances cannot access them. The Vatican's secret archives contain approximately 53 miles of shelving, 53 miles of documents, many dating back over 1,000 years, and the sections dealing with the Templar trials, their interrogations, their confessions under torture, and most critically, the inventory of what was actually found in their treasure vaults, remain classified. Still, in the 21st century. Why? Because what the Templars discovered was not gold. It was knowledge. And that knowledge was so dangerous to the foundations of Christian doctrine that it could not be allowed to exist. When King Philip IV arrested thousands of Templars across France in a single dawn raid, he expected to find the legendary Templar treasure. His soldiers tore apart every Templar facility in France. They found almost nothing. No gold, no jewels. But more importantly, they found no documents. The treasure and the archives had already been moved. 60 Templar ships had departed from La Rochelle harbor the night before the arrests. Where did they go? Portugal, Scotland, possibly the Americas, 2 centuries before Columbus. But some of those ships went south, to North Africa, to Egypt, because that is where the secret began. Here is what the official history wants you to believe. 9 French knights arrived in Jerusalem in 1119. They offered to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the holy sites. The king of Jerusalem gave them headquarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, built on the ruins of Solomon's Temple. They spent 9 years there, then returned to Europe, where suddenly they became rich and powerful. That is the story in every textbook. But it makes no sense. Think about it. 9 knights protecting pilgrims on dangerous roads. That is not an army. That is not even a proper patrol. For 9 years, there is no record of them protecting a single pilgrim. No battles fought. No ambushes prevented. Nothing. What were they actually doing for 9 years? They were digging. Contemporary Arab sources describe the Templars excavating beneath the Temple Mount, not expanding rooms, not building defenses, excavating, going down. They were searching for something specific, and whatever they found changed everything. When they returned to Europe, they brought back something that made them untouchable. Pope Innocent II granted them privileges no military order had ever received. They answered to no king, no bishop, no local authority. Only to the Pope himself. They became exempt from all taxes. They could build their own churches. They could keep all the spoils of war. Within 20 years, 9 landless knights had become the wealthiest organization in Christendom. You do not get that kind of power by protecting pilgrims. What did they find beneath the Temple Mount? The Church says they found nothing, but documents that escaped the purge tell a different story. In 1308, a Templar named Jean de Chalon testified during the trials. Under torture, most Templars confessed to whatever their interrogators wanted to hear, but some, before they died, said things that were not part of the script. Jean de Chalon said the Templars possessed knowledge of the true origins of Christianity. He said they had found proof that the story of Jesus was not unique, that it was based on older stories, much older, Egyptian stories. He was burned at the stake before he could elaborate. His written testimony was sealed, but fragments survived. Another Templar, Geoffroy de Gonneville, spoke of maps. Ancient maps showing trade routes between Egypt and Jerusalem that predated the construction of Solomon's temple. Maps that suggested the sacred knowledge claimed to be divinely revealed to the Hebrews had actually been copied from Egyptian priests. Maps that showed Templar expeditions along those same routes, 2,000 years later, retracing the path of that ancient knowledge transfer. He described Templar knights measuring the pyramids, copying hieroglyphs from temple walls in Luxor, searching through tombs in the Valley of the Kings. He said they were looking for something the Egyptians had hidden before the rise of Rome, something that would prove Christianity was not a divine revelation, but a continuation of Egyptian mystery religions. Geoffroy was also burned. His testimony was also sealed. Are you starting to see the pattern? Every Templar who spoke about Egypt during the trials was executed quickly, and their words were suppressed. But the interrogators kept asking about Egypt, again and again. In the secret depositions that have leaked over the centuries, the same questions appear. What did you find in Egypt? Who gave you permission to excavate there? What scrolls did you bring back? What did they contain? The Church was terrified of something specific. They knew the Templars had gone to Egypt. They knew the Templars had found something there. And they knew that whatever it was could not be allowed to become public knowledge. So they destroyed the order. They burned the men. And they burned every document that mentioned what those men had discovered. But they did not get everything, because the Templars knew they were coming. Someone warned them. Possibly a sympathetic cardinal in Rome. Possibly spies in Philip's court. However they found out, they had time to hide the most important evidence. 60 ships worth of cargo, documents, artifacts, physical proof of what they had uncovered. And for 700 years, the Church has been searching for where those ships went. Because somewhere, in a vault or a cave or a forgotten monastery, the evidence still exists. The evidence that the Knights Templar discovered something in Egypt that would destroy the credibility of Christianity. Something so dangerous that 800 years later, the Vatican still classifies documents related to it. Something that you were never supposed to know existed. Until now. In 1894, a French archaeologist named Charles Mauss was cataloging manuscripts in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France when he found something that should not exist. It was a parchment map, dated to 1241, showing detailed trade routes from Acre to Cairo. This alone was unusual. Medieval maps were notoriously imprecise, more decorative than functional. But this map was different. It showed accurate distances, precise geographical features, and most disturbing of all, it marked specific locations along the Nile with Templar crosses. Not Christian crosses, Templar crosses. The 8-pointed cross that was the symbol of the order. Maus published a paper about his discovery. 3 months later, he was dismissed from his position. His paper was retracted, and the map disappeared from the library's catalog. It has never been seen again. This was not an isolated incident. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as European scholars gained access to archives that had been sealed for centuries, a pattern emerged. Maps kept appearing, documents kept surfacing, all suggesting the same impossible thing. The Knights Templar had been active in Egypt, not just passing through on their way to Jerusalem. Active, establishing contacts with local authorities, conducting excavations, paying Egyptian guides to take them to specific temples, recording measurements of pyramids and obelisks, copying inscriptions that no medieval European should have been able to read. And every time these documents appeared, they vanished again. Purchased by anonymous buyers, reclassified as forgeries, locked away in private collections, or simply destroyed. Why would maps showing Templar activity in Egypt be so dangerous that they needed to be systematically suppressed? Because they prove the official story is a lie. The Church has always maintained that the Templars were exclusively focused on the Holy Land. Jerusalem, Acre, the Crusader kingdoms, defending pilgrims, fighting Saracens, that was their mission, their sole purpose. But if they were in Egypt, that changes everything. Egypt was not Christian territory. It was not part of the Crusades. It was Muslim-controlled and had been for centuries. What possible reason would Templar Knights have to risk their lives traveling to Egypt, unless they were looking for something specific, something they believed was hidden there, something worth dying for? In 1909, a British historian named Sir William Cecil Hampden published a book that almost destroyed his career. It was called The Eastern Routes of the Temple Knights. In it, he compiled every reference he could find to Templar movements outside the traditional Crusader territories. References in Arab chronicles, mentions in Byzantine records, fragments from Armenian merchants' letters. What he discovered was shocking. Between 1150 and 1291, there are at least 47 documented instances of Templar Knights traveling to Egypt. Not armies, small groups, 5 or 6 knights at a time, sometimes accompanied by scribes, often carrying surveying equipment, always heading to the same areas: Giza, Luxor, Aswan, the ancient centers of Egyptian civilization. Hampden's book was savagely reviewed. Academic journals called it speculative fiction. The Catholic Encyclopedia dismissed it as anti-clerical propaganda. Hampden was denied tenure at Oxford. He spent the last 15 years of his life trying to prove his research was legitimate, publishing follow-up papers that no major journal would accept. He died in 1924, professionally ruined and personally broken. But here is what nobody mentions. Every single source Hampden cited was real. The Arab chronicles exist. The Byzantine records exist. The Armenian letters exist. They are all sitting in archives across Europe and the Middle East, available for anyone to verify. But nobody does. Because if you take Hampden seriously, you have to confront an unbearable question. What were the Templars looking for in Egypt? The answer begins with a man named Hugues de Payens. He was one of the 9 founding knights who arrived in Jerusalem in 1119. Official history portrays him as a pious warrior who wanted to protect pilgrims. But there are letters, written by Hugues himself, that paint a very different picture. In 1128, 9 years after arriving in Jerusalem, Hughes wrote to Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential religious figure in Europe. The letter was discovered in 1843 in a monastery in Champagne. In it, Hughes describes finding ancient scrolls beneath the Temple Mount, scrolls that were not Hebrew, not Arabic. He says they were written in a pictorial script that nobody in his company could read. Pictorial script, that is hieroglyphics. Hugues de Payan found Egyptian scrolls buried beneath Solomon's temple. How did Egyptian scrolls end up in Jerusalem? This is not a mystery. We know there was extensive contact between Egypt and ancient Israel. Egyptian pharaohs invaded Israel multiple times. Israelite princes were educated in Egyptian courts. The Old Testament itself mentions Joseph rising to power in Egypt, Moses being raised as an Egyptian prince. There was constant cultural exchange, and the Egyptians were obsessed with preserving knowledge. They wrote everything down, including their religious texts, their creation myths, their rituals for achieving immortality, their secrets for communicating with the divine. If you wanted to understand where ancient religions came from, Egypt was the source. The Hebrews knew this. They preserved Egyptian texts alongside their own sacred writings, and 1,000 years later, the Knights Templar found them. But the scrolls alone were not enough. Hieroglyphics would not be deciphered for another 700 years. The Templars could not read what they had found. So they did the only logical thing. They went to Egypt to find someone who could. Egyptian Coptic Christians still existed in the 13th century. They maintained monasteries in the desert. They preserved ancient knowledge that had been passed down through generations. They could read hieroglyphics, or at least they could read enough to understand what the texts were about. The Templars needed translators, and they needed access to the original temples and tombs where the full versions of these texts were carved into stone. That is why they went to Egypt, not for treasure, for context, for understanding, for the complete story of where Christianity actually came from. There is a document called the Chignon Parchment. It was discovered in Vatican's secret archives in 2001. It contains the testimony of Templar leaders during their trial, taken directly by Pope Clement V's personal envoys. The Catholic Church kept this document hidden for 700 years. When it was finally revealed, scholars noticed something strange. The Templars confessed to spitting on the cross during initiation ceremonies. This was presented as evidence of heresy. But if you read the full testimony, they explain why. They said the cross was a symbol that had been corrupted, that the true meaning of resurrection and eternal life had been stolen from an older tradition. That Jesus was not unique, but was following a path that had been established thousands of years earlier. They said they learned this from texts they found in Egypt. The Church said this was blasphemy. But what if it was just history? In 1263, a Templar commander named Pierre de Sèvres led an expedition to Luxor. We know this because an Arab merchant named Ibn Wasil recorded it in his chronicles. He describes 8 Templar knights arriving with 2 scribes and a Coptic monk. They paid local authorities for permission to enter the Temple of Karnak. They spent 3 weeks inside, measuring columns, copying inscriptions, taking detailed notes. Ibn Wasil says they were particularly interested in the walls depicting the resurrection of Osiris, the Egyptian god who died and was reborn, who promised eternal life to his followers, whose story predates Christianity by 3,000 years. The Templars spent 3 weeks studying how Osiris was resurrected. Then they returned to Acre, and within a year, Templar theology began to change. They started teaching that resurrection was not a miracle, but a process. something that could be understood, something that had been understood long before Jesus. This was the knowledge that destroyed them, not financial corruption, not military defeats, knowledge. The Catholic Church in the 13th century was built entirely on the idea that Jesus was unique, that his resurrection was a singular divine event that proved Christianity was the one true faith. If the Templars could prove that resurrection was an Egyptian concept, that the story of Jesus dying and rising was based on older myths, then Christianity lost its claim to exclusive truth. It became one religion among many, a continuation of pagan traditions. That was unacceptable. So the Templars had to be destroyed, and every piece of evidence connecting them to Egypt had to be erased. But they failed, because maps still exist, documents still survive, hidden in private collections, buried in archives nobody thinks to search, waiting for someone to connect the pieces. And now, 700 years later, the truth is finally emerging. The Knights Templar went to Egypt. They found something that changed everything, and they died rather than let that knowledge be destroyed completely. In 1278, something happened in Egypt that was never supposed to be recorded. A Templar expedition led by Guillaume de Beaujeu, who would later become the last Grand Master of the Order, arrived in Cairo with official permission from the Mamluk Sultan Qalawun. This alone is extraordinary. The Mamluks and the Crusaders were enemies. They had been fighting for decades. Yet here was a Mamluk Sultan granting safe passage to Templar knights. Not to fight, not to negotiate prisoners, to excavate. The permission document still exists in the Egyptian National Archives. It grants the Templars access to conduct archaeological work at Giza for a period of 6 months. 6 months. What were they looking for that required half a year of digging? The answer lies in what happened next. An Egyptian clerk named Hassan ibn Muhammad was assigned to monitor the Templar excavation and report back to the Sultan. His daily reports survived because they were copied into the Sultan's personal records. And what Hassan describes is impossible according to everything we were taught about medieval archaeology. He says the Templars arrived with architectural plans, not crude sketches. Detailed blueprints showing underground chambers beneath the Sphinx, chambers that were not visible from the surface, chambers that Egyptian authorities did not know existed. How did medieval French knights possess accurate architectural plans of sealed underground spaces in Egypt unless someone had given them those plans? Someone who knew what was buried there. Someone from the ancient past. Hassan's reports describe the excavation in detail. The Templars did not dig randomly. They went to a specific location on the northern side of the Sphinx. They removed exactly 7 meters of sand and limestone rubble. Then they uncovered a sealed entrance, a stone door carved with hieroglyphs that Hassan says looked far older than the Sphinx itself. The Templars brought their Coptic monk translator, who spent an entire day studying the inscriptions before they opened the door. Hassan records that the monk became visibly disturbed while reading. He argued with Guillaume de Beaujeu. He said what was written on the door was a warning, that the chamber beyond contained knowledge that was sealed for a reason. Guillaume ordered the door opened anyway, and what they found inside changed everything the Templars believed about Christianity. The chamber was not a tomb. It was a library. Hassan describes walls covered floor to ceiling with carved hieroglyphs. Not decorative, not religious prayers, technical information, instructions. The Templars brought scribes who spent 3 weeks copying everything. Hassan was forbidden from entering, but he could see through the doorway. He says the chamber contained stone tablets arranged on shelves, scrolls preserved in sealed clay jars, and in the center of the room, something he describes as a black stone box covered in gold symbols. The Templars treated this box with extreme reverence. They did not open it in the chamber. They wrapped it carefully and transported it back to their ship in Acre. Whatever was inside that box was more valuable to them than any amount of gold or jewels. It was knowledge, secret knowledge that the ancient Egyptians had deliberately hidden beneath the Sphinx. But here is where the story becomes truly disturbing. Hassan's final report describes what happened when the Templars tried to reseal the chamber. He says the hieroglyphs on the door included a curse, not a superstitious warning, a technical curse, instructions that anyone who entered the chamber would be contaminated with forbidden knowledge, that they would become unable to accept the reality they had known before, that they would see through the lies of all organized religion. Hassan says 3 of the Templar Knights refused to leave Egypt. They abandoned the order right there. They said they could not go back to Europe and pretend to believe in Christian doctrine after seeing what was in that chamber. Guillaume de Beaujeu had them arrested and forcibly returned to Acre. 2 of them later disappeared from Templar records. The third, a knight named Renaud de Vichier, was found dead in his cell 3 months later. The official report said natural causes, but Hassan's account suggests he was executed for heresy, for speaking about what he had seen beneath the Sphinx. What exactly did those hieroglyphs say? We will never know the complete text, because the Templars took their copies with them, and those documents were burned during the Purge of 1307. But fragments survived. In 1912, a researcher named Otto Muck discovered a partial transcript in a monastery in Switzerland. It was hidden inside the binding of a Bible, sewn between the leather and the pages. Someone had concealed it there deliberately, knowing it would be destroyed if discovered. The fragment is only 30 lines long, but those 30 lines are enough to understand why the church was terrified. They describe a ritual, an Egyptian ritual for achieving immortality. Not metaphorical immortality, physical immortality. Instructions for preserving consciousness beyond death. And the ritual is almost identical to the Christian concept of resurrection. Same symbolism, same 3-day time frame, same promise of eternal life, except the Egyptian version was written 3,000 years before Jesus was born. This is what broke the Templars. Not moral corruption, not financial greed. The realization that everything they had been taught was a copy, that Christianity was not a divine revelation, but a recycled Egyptian mystery religion, that Jesus, whether he was real or not, was following a script that had been performed countless times in Egyptian temples. That resurrection was not a miracle but a technology, a process, something the Egyptians had mastered and then deliberately hidden because it gave too much power to whoever controlled it. The Templars found that hidden knowledge, and they understood immediately why it had been sealed away. Because if people knew that resurrection was not unique to Christianity, the entire power structure of the medieval church would collapse. Religion would become just another philosophical system, not divine truth, just human wisdom passed down through generations. The black stone box that Guillaume de Beaujeu took from the chamber was never recovered. After the Templars were destroyed, Philip IV's soldiers searched every Templar facility in France, looking for their legendary treasure. They found nothing. But interrogation records mention the box repeatedly. Torture victims described it in detail. A rectangular container carved from black granite, sealed with gold bands inscribed with symbols, weighing approximately 40 kilograms. small enough to transport, heavy enough to require 2 men to carry. The Templars called it the Archive of First Knowledge. They believed it contained the original instructions for human transcendence, the source material that every religion had copied and corrupted. The Church wanted that box more than anything else, not to study it, to destroy it. But it vanished with the Templar fleet in 1307. 60 ships sailed from La Rochelle. At least one of them carried the archive, and 700 years later, nobody knows where it is. Except there are clues. In 1947, a Templar chapel in Portugal was being renovated when workers discovered a hidden chamber beneath the altar. Inside were 3 scrolls sealed in copper tubes. The scrolls were written in medieval French. They described the contents of the archive in detail. 12 stone tablets. Each tablet contained instructions for a different stage of the resurrection process: preparation of the body, purification of consciousness, techniques for separating awareness from physical form, methods for preserving memory across death, and finally, instructions for reintegration. How to return. How to achieve what the Egyptians called eternal life and Christians called resurrection. The scrolls said the tablets were originally created by priests of Osiris in the age of the pyramids, that they were hidden during a religious purge when the old gods were being replaced, that they remained sealed for 3,000 years until the Templars found them, and that whoever possessed them possessed the power to transcend death itself. The Portuguese government confiscated those scrolls immediately. They were sent to the Vatican. And just like everything else connected to the Templars and Egypt, they disappeared into the archives. But photographs had been taken, copies had been made, and over the decades, fragments have leaked out. Researchers who have seen those fragments describe something that sounds impossible. Technical drawings showing human anatomy, diagrams of brain function, maps of consciousness, precise measurements of electromagnetic frequencies, knowledge that should not exist in a medieval document, knowledge that the ancient Egyptians should not have possessed. Unless they did possess it, unless they understood things about human consciousness and the of death that we are only beginning to rediscover today. Unless the Templars found proof that our ancestors were far more advanced than we were ever told. And that knowledge was deliberately erased because it was too dangerous to allow humanity to remember what we once knew. There is a concept in psychology called cognitive dissonance. It is the mental discomfort you feel when confronted with evidence that contradicts everything you believe to be true. Your brain literally cannot process the contradiction. It causes physical pain, confusion. Some people shut down completely rather than accept that their fundamental understanding of reality is wrong. Now imagine you are a medieval knight. You have dedicated your entire life to Christ. You have taken vows of poverty, chastity, obedience. You have killed in the name of God. You believe with absolute certainty that Christianity is the one true faith revealed by divine miracle. And then you discover proof that everything you were taught is a copy of something older, that your entire belief system is recycled mythology, that the miracle of resurrection you have built your life around was being performed in Egyptian temples 3,000 years before Jesus was born. How do you survive that realization? Most of the Templars who saw the evidence did not survive it. Not physically, mentally. The tablets the Templars found beneath the Sphinx were not vague religious philosophy. They were technical manuals, instruction sets written with precision that rivals modern scientific documentation. The fragments that have survived describe step-by-step procedures for manipulating human consciousness. specific breathing patterns to induce altered states, exact measurements of sound frequencies to trigger transcendental experiences, chemical compounds derived from plants that could separate awareness from physical sensation. The Egyptians had systematized the entire process of what they called walking between worlds, what Christians would later call resurrection. But the Egyptian version was not a divine gift. It was a learnable skill, a technology that could be taught, practiced, and mastered. Anyone could do it. That was the secret. That was what made it so dangerous. Because if resurrection is a technology, then Jesus was not God. He was a practitioner, someone who had learned the Egyptian techniques and demonstrated them publicly. The Templars found Egyptian texts describing the exact same process that appears in the Gospels. Death, 3 days of transition, return to physical form. But the Egyptian texts were dated, carbon dated in modern tests, to approximately 1,500 years before the birth of Christ. The sequence of events was identical. The symbolism was identical. Even the specific details matched. The darkness at noon, the tearing of the veil, the earthquake. All of these appear in Egyptian resurrection texts, not as metaphors, as observable phenomena that occur during the transition process. The Templars realized they were reading the instruction manual that the Gospel writers had used as their source material. Christianity was not original. It was Egyptian repackaged as divine revelation. But it gets worse. The tablets included historical information, names, dates, a chronology of how the resurrection knowledge had been transmitted through different cultures. The Egyptians taught it to the Hebrews during the Exodus. Moses, according to these texts, was an initiate of the Osiris priesthood. He learned the resurrection techniques in Egypt and brought them to Israel. He passed the knowledge to the priestly class, who guarded it as their most sacred secret. For 1,000 years, it was preserved in the Temple of Solomon, hidden in the Holy of Holies where only the high priest could access it. And when the temple was destroyed by the Romans, the knowledge was buried beneath the ruins. It remained there for another 1,000 years until 9 French knights arrived with information about where to dig. Information that could only have come from someone who knew the temple's secret architecture. Someone inside the Catholic Church who wanted the Templars to find what was hidden there. Who gave the Templars that information? This is the question that terrified the medieval church, because it implies a conspiracy within Christianity itself, a group within the church that knew the truth about Jesus, that knew Christianity was based on Egyptian mystery religions, that knew resurrection was not a unique miracle but an ancient technology, and that wanted this information to be rediscovered and revealed. The Templars were not acting alone. They were being guided. Someone in Rome, possibly within the papal court itself, was feeding them information, telling them where to dig in Jerusalem, arranging their access to Egypt, protecting them from investigation for decades. The Templars were pawns in a much larger game, a war between factions within the church, one side that wanted to maintain the official doctrine, and another side that wanted to expose the truth, that wanted humanity to know that divine revelation was a lie, that the power of the priesthood was based on controlled access to ancient knowledge. This explains why the Templars were granted such extraordinary privileges, why they answered only to the Pope, why they were exempt from all local authority. They were being protected by someone at the highest levels of church power, someone who needed them to complete their investigation before the conservative faction could stop them. And for 80 years, the plan worked. The Templars excavated Jerusalem, They traveled to Egypt. They copied the texts. They translated the tablets. They accumulated absolute proof that Christianity was not divinely revealed, and they began to teach this knowledge within their order. That is when everything fell apart. Because you cannot keep a secret that explosive contained within an organization of thousands of men spread across 12 countries. Word leaked out. Rumors spread. And the conservative faction within the church realized what was happening. The Templars had to be destroyed immediately. Not arrested, not investigated, annihilated. Every knight killed or imprisoned. Every document burned. Every piece of evidence eliminated before the truth could spread beyond their order. The purge was planned with military precision. King Philip IV was not acting on his own initiative. He was following orders from Pope Clement V. But Clement himself was under pressure from a faction within the Vatican that had decided the Templar investigation had gone too far. The arrest warrants were identical across all of Europe, issued simultaneously, targeting specific individuals: the Templars who had been to Egypt, the translators who had read the tablets, the scribes who had copied the texts, the knights who had seen the chamber beneath the Sphinx. These men were arrested first, interrogated first, executed first, before they could speak publicly, before they could reveal what they knew. The trials were theatrical, public confessions to crimes that sounded absurd, spitting on the cross, denying Christ, worshipping a severed head. Nobody was supposed to take these charges seriously. They were cover stories, justifications for executions that were already decided. The real crime was knowledge. The Templars knew too much, and knowledge that threatens institutional power cannot be allowed to exist. But some of the Templars understood what was coming. They had warning, possibly from the same faction within the church that had originally supported them. They had time to hide the evidence. The 60 ships that sailed from La Rochelle carried more than gold. They carried copies of every text the Templars had translated, drawings of every tablet they had found, maps showing the location of the chamber beneath the Sphinx, testimonies from knights who had witnessed the excavations, physical artifacts taken from Egyptian temples, and most importantly, the archive itself, the black stone box containing the original tablets. All of this evidence was divided among multiple ships to ensure that even if some were captured, others would escape. And they did escape. Some went to Scotland, some to Portugal, some possibly to the Americas. But the most important cargo went to a location that was never recorded, a place so secret that 700 years of searching has never found it. Somewhere, in a sealed vault or a hidden monastery or a cave deep underground, the complete Templar archive still exists, waiting to be discovered, waiting to destroy Christianity the moment it comes to light. This is why the Vatican still classifies Templar documents. This is why archaeological excavations at Giza are carefully controlled. This is why researchers who ask too many questions about Templar activity in Egypt have their careers destroyed. Because the evidence is still out there. The Templars made copies. They distributed the information, and over 7 centuries, fragments have continued to surface. Each fragment confirming the same impossible story, that Christianity is Egyptian, that resurrection is technology. That Jesus, if he existed, was using techniques that were already 3,000 years old, that the Catholic Church has spent 2,000 years claiming divine authority for knowledge they stole from another civilization, and that the Knights Templar died because they discovered the theft and refused to stay silent. They chose truth over power, knowledge over obedience, and it cost them everything: their wealth, their order, their lives. But they succeeded in one thing. They preserved the evidence. They made sure the truth would survive. And now, 800 years later, that truth is finally coming to light. Not in academic journals, not through official channels, but through people like you, who ask questions, who demand answers, who refuse to accept comfortable lies when uncomfortable truth is available. The Templars are gone, but their knowledge survived, and it is about to change everything you thought you knew about the origins of Western religion. On the morning of March 18th, 1314, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar was burned alive in Paris. Jacques de Molay had been imprisoned for 7 years, tortured repeatedly, offered freedom if he would confess and renounce his order. He refused. As the flames rose around him, witnesses reported that he spoke clearly and without fear. He did not beg for mercy. He did not pray for salvation. Instead, he issued a curse. He summoned Pope Clement V and King Philip IV to meet him before God's throne within a year. Both men died within 9 months. But that is not the interesting part. The interesting part is what Jacques de Molay said after the curse. His final words, recorded by multiple witnesses, were these: "The knowledge survives. The guardians remain. You have burned the knights, but you cannot burn the truth." Those words were dismissed as the ravings of a dying man. But they were not ravings. They were a message, a signal to Templars who had escaped, a confirmation that the mission had succeeded. The evidence had been hidden, the knowledge had been preserved, and guardians had been appointed to protect it until the time came to reveal it. Who were these guardians? Not an official organization. Nothing that could be traced or targeted. Instead, the Templars did something brilliant. They embedded their knowledge into other structures, secret societies that already existed, merchant guilds, craftsmen brotherhoods, groups that had legitimate reasons to maintain privacy and exclusive membership. Over the decades following the Templar destruction, these organizations began displaying symbolism that should not exist. Egyptian symbolism, Osiris imagery, pyramid and obelisk designs. The most obvious example is Freemasonry. The Freemasons claim their traditions date back to the construction of Solomon's Temple. This is historically absurd. Freemasonry as an institution only appears in documented records in the 16th century. But their rituals, their symbols, their degrees of initiation, all contain Egyptian elements that nobody in medieval Europe should have known. Unless someone taught them. Unless Templar survivors passed their knowledge to stonemason guilds, knowing these craftsmen would preserve it within their rituals, knowing it would survive hidden in plain sight. The Masonic third-degree ritual is called the raising of Hiram Abiff. It depicts the death and resurrection of a master builder. The candidate lies in a coffin, symbolically dies, and is raised to new life. This is presented as a legend about Solomon's Temple, but the ritual is identical to the Egyptian raising of Osiris. The same symbolism, the same 3-stage process: death, transition, rebirth. The same promise of transformation through secret knowledge. Freemasons perform an Egyptian resurrection ritual and claim it is about a Hebrew builder. Why? Because the Templars gave them the ritual and told them to disguise its origins, to preserve the knowledge without revealing where it came from. For 400 years, this worked perfectly. Freemasonry spread across Europe and eventually to the Americas. Millions of men performed the ritual, and none of them knew they were practicing Egyptian mystery religion. None of them knew they were guardians of Templar secrets, until someone started asking questions. In 1717, Freemasonry went public. 4 lodges in London merged and created the first Grand Lodge. They published their constitutions, explained their history, or rather, they published a sanitized version designed to seem respectable. But within a decade, researchers began noticing inconsistencies. The symbols did not match the official story. The rituals contained elements that predated Christianity. The architecture of Masonic temples was not Hebrew, it was Egyptian. By the late 18th century, scholars like Carl Lening and Albert Pike were publishing detailed analyses proving that Freemasonry preserved pre-Christian religious knowledge. Pike's book, Morals and Dogma, explicitly states that Masonic rituals are derived from Egyptian and Persian mystery religions. He describes the connection to the Knights Templar. He explains how the knowledge was passed down through generations of initiates, and he was not condemned for this. He was celebrated. Because by the 18th century, the Catholic Church no longer had absolute power. The Enlightenment had happened. People could discuss alternative religious ideas without being burned alive. The Templar knowledge could finally begin to emerge from hiding. But the most dramatic confirmation came in the 20th century, with the development of modern archaeology and radiocarbon dating, when researchers finally had tools to verify what the Templars had claimed, and the results were devastating to Christian orthodoxy. Egyptian texts describing resurrection rituals were definitively dated to 1500 years before Christ. The pyramid texts, carved inside burial chambers at Saqqara, contain explicit instructions for achieving eternal life. The same instructions that appear in Christian scripture. The same promise, the same symbolism. Except the Egyptian version is demonstrably older. This is not speculation. This is not alternative history. This is mainstream Egyptology. Academic consensus. The Christian concept of resurrection is based on Egyptian religion. Scholars know this. They teach it in universities. But somehow, this information never reaches the general public. Somehow, most Christians have no idea that their central belief is borrowed from an earlier civilization. And then there is the physical evidence. In 1993, Egyptian authorities discovered an anomaly beneath the Sphinx using ground-penetrating radar, a rectangular void, approximately 9 meters long, 6 meters wide, 3 meters deep, located exactly where Hassan ibn Muhammad described the Templars excavating in 1278. The Egyptian government refused to excavate. They claimed the Sphinx plateau was too fragile, that any digging might cause structural damage. But researchers who worked on the project tell a different story. They say Egyptian authorities contacted the Vatican immediately after the void was discovered. That representatives from Rome arrived within days. That pressure was applied to halt all investigation. That the Egyptian Antiquities Ministry received substantial funding shortly thereafter. And that the chamber beneath the Sphinx remains sealed and officially denied to this day. 700 years after the Templars opened it, the evidence is still there. Still hidden. Still protected by the same institutions that destroyed the Templars for finding it. But the truth keeps leaking out. In 2001, the Chinon parchment was revealed. In 2007, French researchers published documentation of Templar expeditions to Egypt. In 2012, ground-penetrating radar confirmed additional voids beneath the Giza Plateau. In 2019, a team of archaeologists in Portugal found Templar artifacts that included Egyptian scarabs and amulets that carbon-dated to the 13th dynasty. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle. Each piece confirms what the Templars knew 800 years ago. that Christianity is not original, that resurrection is not unique, that the foundations of Western religion are built on stolen Egyptian knowledge, and that institutions of power will do anything to prevent this information from becoming common knowledge. So why are you only hearing about this now? Why is this not taught in schools? Why do history documentaries focus on Templar treasure hunts instead of what they actually discovered? Because the same power structures that destroyed the Templars in 1307 still exist. The Vatican is still one of the wealthiest and most influential organizations on Earth. Academic institutions are still funded by religious endowments. Media companies are still owned by people who benefit from maintaining the status quo. And the status quo requires that Christianity be seen as divinely revealed truth, not as one mythology among many, not as a continuation of earlier traditions. The moment people understand that resurrection is an Egyptian concept, Christianity loses its claim to exclusive spiritual authority, and billions of dollars in institutional power evaporate. So the information is suppressed. Not through violent persecution anymore, through subtler means, academic gatekeeping, media silence, algorithmic suppression. The truth is available if you search for it, but you have to search. It will not be presented to you. You have to want to know badly enough to dig through archives and research papers and obscure historical documents, just like the Templars did 800 years ago. And that brings us to the final question. The question Jacques de Molay died protecting. Where is the archive? Where did those 60 ships go? Where is the black stone box containing the original tablets? Because if it still exists, if someone finds it and makes the contents public, everything changes. Not gradually, instantly. Proof that resurrection is Egyptian technology would demolish 2,000 years of Christian doctrine overnight. It would validate every alternative historian who has been ridiculed for suggesting ancient civilizations were more advanced than we acknowledge. It would force a complete reevaluation of human history and the origins of religion. And it would reveal that the Knights Templar were not heretics. They were truth seekers. They found evidence that threatened institutional power, and they chose to preserve that evidence rather than destroy it. They sacrificed their order, their wealth, and their lives to ensure the truth would survive. And it did survive. Hidden in rituals, encoded in symbols, scattered across archives, waiting in sealed chambers beneath the Egyptian desert. The guardians never died. They just went underground. And now, in the age of the internet, when information cannot be completely controlled, the knowledge they protected is finally reaching the people it was hidden from. You. The truth the Templars died for is no longer secret. It is here, available, undeniable. The only question is, what are you going to do with it?